That's the quietest 3 minutes I've ever lived through, I think. Well, good morning and welcome to the Spring Gardening Seminar Series presented by the Central Oregon Master Gardeners, Oregon State University, and our sponsors. Thank you for joining us on this cool April day. My name is Nancy Glick and I'll be your host. The other Master Gardener assisting behind the scenes today is Rocky Bissett. Our presenter is Amy Jo Detweiler, who will talk about an overview of the home ignition zone, characteristics of the fire-resistant and fire-prone plants, and generally Firewise design principles and maintenance. The webinar will also include a case study and plant selections for Central Oregon. But first, some housekeeping for our webinar. All videos and microphones are off except for the presenters. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A window. We'll reserve time at the end to answer anything that was not addressed during the slide presentation. The presentation is being recorded and will be available online for a short period of time following the session. A few days after the session, you'll be sent an email with a link to access the recording. We'll also send you any links that Amy Jo mentions in her presentation. Amy Jo Detweiler, professor and extension horticulturist, is responsible for teaching and outreach in community and commercial horticulture in the high desert environment of Central Oregon, working with homeowners and green industry professionals. She specializes in sustainable landscape practices, including water-wise gardening, fire-wise landscaping, and backyard food production. She's also responsible for training and managing an active group of Master Gardener volunteers for a tri-county region. At this point, I'll turn things over to Amy Jo.
Hi, thanks, Nancy. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning for our talk on Firewise landscaping. For questions, you can go ahead and put your questions, enter them in manually. I'm going to wait until the end of the presentation to answer questions specific to the presentation. For more general questions, if you have those as you go, Rocky will help assist answer those. Give me just a minute here and I'll share the screen. All right, are you seeing the screen? Can I get a thumbs up? Are you seeing the cover screen? Yep, awesome, okay. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Firewise landscaping. Here's an overview of some of the things we're going to look at today. And just so you know up front, I'm a horticulturist and my specialty is landscape plant material. I'm not a fire scientist, so I don't spend a lot of time on fire behavior and those types of things because that's not what I specialize in. My primary focus is talking about fire-resistant plant types and some basic principles on Firewise landscape design. So today I'll cover things about the home ignition zone, characteristics of fire-prone and fire-resistant type plants, and plant selection. So when I first started out in this position and as wildfires were coming into the season, I used to collect all the articles as it relates to wildfires and just trying to keep track statistically of how many we were having in our region and what was going on there. What started to happen is I found myself collecting articles more and more frequently, and at some point I just kind of stopped, but was always amazed to read about the more urban fires, even more so than ones we would expect in wildlands. So unfortunately, statistically, we're seeing an increase in the number of wildfires in the Western United States. So moving on from that, if you have an interest, there's some really good websites that can give you statistical information, and I'll cover those, but you know, it's been discouraging to see that increasing number go up over the years. So we're going to talk about some ways now to help try and be proactive here in the Central Oregon region. So I just go into a little bit on, you know, fire behavior basics, and you know, this is what's called the fire triangle. These are the three elements you need in order for a fire to exist: so the heat, fuel, and oxygen. Now, if you put the fire behavior triangle next to that, these are the three elements that influence the way of a fire behaves. So weather, topography, and again, fuel. So if you put these two side by side, what is that one common element that occurs between both the fire basic triangle and the fire behavior triangle? And you can see that common denominator there is fuel. The good news about this is fuel is the one element we can actually influence. So for today's presentation, when I'm talking about fuel, I'm talking about anything that burns, from the plant material in a landscape to other parts surrounding the home or parts of the home that can burn as fuel. Without the proper amount and arrangement of fuel, a fire can't burn. So we're going to talk about spacing, arrangement, and design principles in that regard. Just going a little bit into the science on how a home can burn. There's really three ways a home can burn. One would be direct contact. Here's an example from the skeleton fire, which occurred here in Central Oregon. And that's when the fire starts right with the fuel source, for example, in this case, a structure or a home. So direct flames. Radiant heat can be another way that a home catches on fire. And this is interesting. This is part of some work that was done by Jack Cohen. Jack Cohen is a well-known fire scientist. And this was part of one of his experiments to determine how close to a house a fire can get before ignition happens. And for some of the work that he did, he showed that radiant heat from as far as 100 foot away could actually start the siding of a home on fire. And then the last way that a home can be impacted by fire is through embers or firebrands. And this has become a more increasing concern over time as the firebrands can get into the siding and through vent systems, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of work being done looking at ways to prevent embers from entering the ventilation systems or entering the homes and open spaces. So two of the primary factors that have emerged as determinants of a home's ability to survive a wildfire include roofing materials and the quality of the defensible space. I'm not going to get into talking about non-combustible building materials, but it's known that if you're using non-combustible roofing and siding materials, it's going to be a really large step in creating that defensible space. I also wanted to just throw this out there up front. This is some research that was done by Chris Dunn from Oregon State University, the College of Forestry. And this was interesting. If you'd like to dig into this type of research, I would recommend you check this site out. We can put this in the chat box for you, this link. But what was interesting about this is what he found was, in looking at, I think if you dig in the research, it's over 20,000 case studies of fires that were started. And if you look at this numbers there, 60% of the cross boundary from private to public lands were ignited on private property, with only 28% originating in national forests. So what they found is that fires are more likely to burn their way into the national forest from private lands rather than the other way around, which is kind of the common narrative that a lot might have in mind. So moving into the home ignition zone. This is an example of what's called the home ignition zone. And the home ignition zone is just thinking about the surroundings around your home and how you should be considering making that a more defensible space. So there are national standards in regards to the home ignition zone with 3 different zones here. You can see in this image, the first zone is the 0 to 5 feet directly around the home. That's called the immediate zone. If you move out to the next intermediate zone, that's 5 foot to 30 foot. And then 30 to 100 feet is the extended zone. Now, a lot of places in Central Oregon, you may not even have 100 feet beyond your home before you're up against the neighbor's home. And so what I would say for those examples is still try and practice these examples as best you can. And it could be that you're just kind of using the principles from the immediate zone and the intermediate zone, and you don't even have an extended zone in which to work with. So you're just kind of concentrating on that immediate zone for your landscape elements and your intermediate zone. So if you look at this, the way this image is depicted is on the right side are practices that are not recommended, as opposed to those on the left side. So for example, on that right side, of course, roofing material, not to have a cedar shake roof or flammable roofing material, removing a wood deck, replacing that with something non-flammable. You don't want conifers up close to that roof line within that space or touching the roof line. Just having conifers in general around the perimeter of the home, up close against the home, you would want to remove those and create an open space with no plant material that's flammable in that first 0 to 5 feet. Keeping your grasses mowed down to a reasonable height. We'll go into more detail on some of these distinct features. Those are just some examples of how to start to create that defensible space. So looking more closely at this immediate zone right around the home, you can see here in the image, this is a homeowner in Bend that is converting his landscape to become more Firewise. And so he just started transitioning right around the home with the mulching material that he had. If you look to the photo on the right, you can see in that photo that, let's see if the cursor, I can pull that in. Not sure I can get that to show up for you, but you can see the one on the right, there's a transition area going from wood bark mulch materials to a decorative rock. And so he was starting to work on that and doing it in phases. So just immediately getting the wood bark mulch up away from the home and replacing it with decorative rock mulch materials and starting to push that out. And so protecting that first 0 to 5 feet is a really critical component. So you'll want to think about things like what types of mulching materials you're using. You don't want to be putting down weed barrier or weed cloth, anything plastic that could burn. But probably the best recommendation would be some sort of decorative rock or gravel. Here's another example of a home. This was not specifically designed to be Firewise, but I felt like when I took this photo, there's some really nice Firewise features in this particular landscape. This was a home we had on our garden tour in Bend a couple seasons ago. And so if in looking at this photo, you can see just some elements of a Firewise landscape, including that decorative rock. Again, you can see some of the larger paving stones to step on, having pavers as patio feature, just that clear space around the home, low growing ground covers, those types of things can help create a defensible space. And so they have some woolly thyme and some other low growing ground covers we'll get into later. And you can see how close they are to the neighbors here. This is one of your typical urban environments in the Bend area. And so you can see they have space there, but not a lot of space between neighbors. So when it comes to creating a Firewise environment, really in homes where you're close to your neighbors, it's really the best thing you can do is have that neighborhood discussion about becoming a community of being Firewise. So Firewise communities are going to have a lot more impact. So coming together on the types of features in creating a defensible space for the neighborhood as a whole, and not just individual homes. The intermediate zone is the next 5 to 30 feet. So really, just to recap, the immediate zone, really no plant material should be included in the immediate zone, which can be a little heartbreaking for those of us that love plants, but it really is the safest way to create that defensible space, not having anything up against the home if possible. In that intermediate zone, 5 to 30 feet, consider your design spacing there. You want to clear any vegetation that may be dead, dying, or not performing very well. You want to keep any lawns or native grasses mowed to 4 inches or lower if possible. And you want to remove any ladder fuels. And so we'll talk more specifically about what a ladder fuel is here in a minute. But these are some tips to be thinking about in that intermediate zone. So kind of the main area of landscape design. So ladder fuels can be defined as fuels such as branches, shrubs, and understory layer of trees that are arranged and growing in continuous layers from the ground up that would allow a fire to spread upwards from the ground to the forest canopy, creating embers potentially. So the goal in creating a more Firewise landscape is to remove those ladder fuels so that you're taking out those steps and not allowing that ground fire to become, or that surface fire to become a crown fire in the upper canopy of trees. So here are just some examples of things that can be done. For example, in this photo, making this a more Firewise space would be removing that blue spruce so that it's not touching the roof line. You'd want to take it out. And ornamental grasses, again, they get to be well over 4 inches, which is the recommended height to keep grasses at or lower. So something like this, again, moving that away from that home. So you're pushing those out. It doesn't mean you can't have anything like this in your landscape. No, but you want to be thoughtful about placement. I'd have something like this if I had an individual conifer and or a tall ornamental grass. I'd be pushing those out to the furthest boundaries out in my landscape away from my structure because they are not Firewise plant materials. And if you're going to use them, maybe use them in isolation and not have anything around them that's going to continue that fuel. Here's an example that I took of an alternative to turf grass in the front yard. This is Delosperma. The common name for this is ice plant or hardy ice plant. Not to be confused with the ice plant that is considered an invasive in California. If you're from that area, this is not the same genus at all. It's a different plant that is not considered invasive, but can be a good alternative as a ground cover. Not going to be steppable. You're not going to be able to step on it without damaging it, but it can be used as an alternative and has a lot of moisture content in it. So it's a good Firewise plant choice. And here they have a little mixture going on here. So a little bit of turf grass in the surrounding area, but then mostly this Delosperma and some other low growing plant material. You can see it goes up to the gravel you see on the left-hand lower corner, that's leading up to the front of the home. So with Firewise landscapes, remember the real purpose or goal behind landscaping with fire-resistant plant materials to create that attractive landscape while at the same time not adding to the fire potential or hazard. So here's an example. The house in this case is off to the right. And these aspen that are planted, you can see some smaller ponderosa pine coming up in the forefront of the photograph. That's you'd want to go ahead and take those out. And then the aspen that are here in the image, they're going to be fire resistant type plant material, and that's going to help break up that fuel ladder if the fire was to start off to the left of the frame and move towards the home. It kind of blocks some of that heat and slow the fire down. So this is from the National Fire Protection Association recommended distances and planting within those zones. So you can see here in this image, I'll pull that in a little closer. The first 0 to 5 feet, again, no plant material in that area surrounding the immediate home. You can use, this is where you can get creative with hardscaping for your landscape. You can use, maybe ornamental garden art, those types of things. Potentially a couple of annual baskets that are going to be watered and kept moist can be put in this first 0 to 5 feet. But other than that, you don't want any other flammable plant material that next 5 to 30 feet. If you're gonna have plant material, the suggestion is to plant plants in groupings and then have lots of space between the groupings. So depending on how much room you have, you'd want to do some beds there. You would cluster your plant material together and then have significant space. So if you have a grouping of plant material that's at its mature width is going to spread to that 10 feet wide, then you wouldn't want another bed. You'd want to double that and have another bed, that's going to be at least 20 feet away from that. So using those types of principles here, you can see trees, the top canopies. Again, you're wanting to think about the mature width of these trees as they mature over time. But you have 18 feet between the tree canopies. So again, you're wanting to make sure that if something was to catch on fire here, it's not going to be able to easily catch the next plant on fire outside of that cluster planting. And here, going out into that extended zone area, you can start to group things a little bit more closely together if need be. So you're going from 12 feet between those top tree canopies down to 6 feet as you get out into that extended zone. You can see from 30 to 60 how that changes. So one of the rules of thumbs you can use within that intermediate zone, which is where most of us are living when we're thinking about our plant material that we visually see from our homes or enjoy. That horizontal spacing, you want to make sure that if you're planting something, for example, and let's use spireas, common shrub here. If that spirea is going to be, say 3 foot wide, or in this case, azaleas are mentioned, but we'd probably be more likely to use a spirea here than an azalea. But if it gets to be that 3 foot wide, then the next planting really should be 6 feet away so that you have space between those. As they both get 3 feet and 3 feet, you have double the space between it to the next shrub. And again, applying those concepts to clumps or cluster plantings, which most of us are probably going to be doing more like a cluster type planting, especially if we have less space to work with, and we're not in one of those wildland urban interfaces. If you're looking at more like urban city lots. Here's an example of a home that includes a fire resistant landscape. This was a retired fire chief in Bend in the Deschutes River Woods area. And they spent a lot of time making sure that our house was fire resistant along with the landscaping and making sure there wasn't a lot of fuel, so fuel reduction. This is the area that's within that 30-foot zone to create a defensible space, and it is irrigated. Some of the details in creating that defensible space you can see. In this case, hardy plank siding and a composite roof was used, tempered glass in the windows. But then in the landscape, you have turf grass being used. You can see that perennial border that's up next to the deck there, low growing plant material that really doesn't have a lot of tall cover in it at all. And then some hardscaping with boulders and rock placement. And there, if you pull back out of this photo, now we're starting to go into that extended zone beyond that intermediate zone. And this is going to be where you have some native plants in the background, some of which are Firewise and some of those are not. In this case, he also put a pond in to provide a water source to fight a potential fire if that should happen. So when it comes to limbing and pruning, landscape maintenance practices are really important for keeping plant material healthy, regardless of what type of plant you're using. So when it comes to limbing and pruning up trees, ideally, you're taking out those ladder fuels at the base of trees, especially if you have native conifer in your landscape area. For example, ponderosa pine, you're going to take those plants out. Usually you're limbing the tree up 3 times the height of what is beneath it. So if your plant's going to get 3 feet at maturity, you're going to want to limb up 9 feet and take those lower limbs off of that ponderosa pine again, so that you're breaking up that ladder fuel continuum of fire should a ground or surface fire start. So here's what that would look like. And so you're taking off both dead limbs and live limbs in that case, just to keep it nice and clear. Here's an example of some cleanup that really would need to get done in an area like this, where you'd want to be limbing up all of those lower branches that are dead, cleaning up the grasses, keeping them mowed to 4 inches or less. In this case, going up, if you don't have large shrubs underneath it, just go up to at least 10 feet to produce those laddered fuels. And here's what a cleared out area looks like. So this is one example of reducing fuel around the home. And this is going back to the fire chief's home and how he reduced that fuel load. You can see how mean, lean, and clean it is there in that extended zone. So it's really important to be thinking about plant material, which we'll discuss in a little bit here, but also the arrangement of plant material. So the design of the plant material is really critical, because arrangement really does impact whether or not a fire is going to lead to a structure fire. So vegetation and the right or wrong arrangement can convey fire to the home. This was the skeleton fire, which was in Bend back in the late 90s. And in this case, this homeowner had done some thinning and limbing of trees, and they did have some green space around the entire home. You can see there some lawn and around the home. But unfortunately, they didn't think about the ornamental juniper that was surrounding the home. Up in the corner here, they had some ornamental juniper right around here. So even though they had done some defensible space preparation, they hadn't thought through all of it. And unfortunately, an ember brand came in from the wildfire that was burning and hit one of those ornamental juniper, which then caught fire and started to spread just kind of up around the home. And you can see here how it went up and was burning the eaves of the home here in this case. Thankfully, the wildfire crew was able to come in here and to put the fire out, because they were nearby and in the area already. So thankfully the home survived. So that's where topography takes a role too here. You can see if you're on a flat land or flat space, smoke, rises straight up. And so you don't have any of this preheating. But if your home is above the fire, if you are upslope, then you would want to be thinking about how you're thinning and even doing more clearing there, because of the preheating that can occur if a fire was to start downslope from your home. When you start to increase in slope, then you have those flames preheat the fuels above them, and then it can cause a fire to burn uphill faster. So you have to be giving even more spacing than is generally recommended if you are upslope from a wooded area or that wildland urban interface with native plant materials, especially conifers. So here's an example of a homeowner that cleared native vegetation away from his home on the downslope side. You can see here where he thinned out here to try to clean that up and made it really, really clean in front of the home structure here, and then put in some kind of like a tiered bed here, which this would be ready now for some landscape plant material to go in if he wanted to do that. So just knowing that depending on whether or not you live on a slope, you may need to be modifying the distance in which you're going out and actually being thoughtful about creating a defensible space. So as the slope goes up, then you want to be looking further and further out to clear that way in that wildland urban interface, to make sure that you're allowing sufficient clearance and room if there was to be a ground fire that started. So these are the suggested distances for reducing fuels around the home, depending on the slope steepness. You want to be thinking about things of where plant litter or debris collects. So pine needles, leaves coming off trees, those sorts of things. And where you're going to have any accumulation, you want to keep that area cleaned out or prevent it from ever building up in the first place. So for example, something like this, if you have a raised deck, you want to make sure things aren't going to accumulate underneath that deck. In this case, they use this lattice work to try and keep certain, probably more critters and that sort of thing out. But is this going to be sufficient for keeping out debris? Nope, I would say you'd be using something a little more solid than this. You're going to have a lot of stuff still making its way through here, and then it's going to be difficult to get it out. So you want to be thinking about some more solid screening if you have a raised deck like this. Okay, now we're going to transition on to a fire resistance and what that means and fire resistant plant material. So the word fire resistance can have different meanings depending on how you're using it or what and how you're referencing it. In an ecological sense, fire resistant means being able to persist over a long period of time in a fire dominated environment. So strategies like sprouting and specialized seeds that remain dormant are allowed to, those plants persist in a fire dominated ecosystem. So an example that would be like tan oak that I have in the photo here. But that's not the definition we're using for this presentation. When I'm referencing fire resistance, I'm talking about the ability for a plant to resist ignition and or not sustain continued combustion if it was to light on fire. And so kind of that question, answering that question, if if this foliage busts into flames when a match is held to it, does it just smolder and go out, or will it add more fuel and heat to the fire? So an example of a fire resistant plant would be something in the geranium family, for example. Defensible space does work in having a fire resistant vegetation types of plants within a 30-foot irrigated zone helps reduce the fire hazard. This is an example of the skeleton fire that happened in 1996 in Bend, South Bend, and it survived. It had fireproof roofing and siding. And it also had a defensible space around the home. You can see here the lawn area. This was after the fire went through. The fire in this particular case was very intense. The neighbor's garage burned down and the home itself off to the right here almost didn't survive. So these homeowners having that defensible space was allowed to break up that continuum of fuel around their home and protect their home. You can see here that all of the ponderosa pine did burn. Now fast forward post-fire 7 years. So this is in 2003. This photo was taken. It's interesting. You can see those pines, some of those pines that were burned, the buds were not completely consumed by the fire. So they were able to push out new growth the following season. So you can see those two surviving pines and how they came back. Which is kind of interesting to see how that worked. And then it looks like they went back in and started to put in other landscape plant material. You can see here a garage was added since the original photo. And then this is what that home looks like post-fire 25 years later. So just 2021. You can see how that's filled in. And, there's a mix in here, both Firewise and fire resistant type plant material, but just to see the landscape around the home and that extended zone area, just how that looks post-fire. I think I have, all three of them kind of side by side. You can see how that has evolved over 20 plus years. So turf grass is actually one of the most, has a lot high water content in the blade of the grass and is actually one of the more fire resistant type plants in creating a defensible space. And so depending on where you live, it may or may not be an option for you. So let's go into characteristics of highly flammable plant material, and these are just some of those characteristics. Flammable plants tend to have leaves that are aromatic or strongly fragrant. The sap of the plant usually is resinous, has a strong odor, and is gummy or sticky to the touch. The leaves, twigs, and stems might have volatile waxes, terpenes, or oils in them. And sometimes it's just the characteristic of the plant, the way it grows. It may have papery or loose bark. It may have a growth habit that collects material within it. For example, ornamental juniper here, it'll exfoliate the dead needles from the inside once they're done being used. As the plant gets bigger and bigger, those needles are no longer needed, so they shed off. And the way the branching pattern of that plant, it collects all that dead material within. That makes it become more flammable over time. So here's a cutaway you can see of how that branching pattern is, and just a close-up of how all those dead needles accumulate within that plant. So this is kind of a double whammy where you have the growth habit affecting the plant, making it more fire prone as it becomes mature over time. And then you also have the actual content of the needles themselves that are aromatic, resinous, and have oils in them that are more flammable. So this would be a plant you would not want to include. It's a really common plant for screening privacy year-round coverage of something, but you would certainly not want to have this in the first 0 to 5. And if you have it in that intermediate zone, you really want these to be as far away from the home or structure as possible because they're very fire prone. Ideally, you're not including this type of plant in the landscape. One of the other types of plants, really, really common, especially for that creating that privacy or screening, is going to be arborvitae. And again, here's a cutaway of how those dead needles, once they're done being used by the plant, exfoliate and kind of collect at the base of the plant or within the plant interior. So there are some other options for screening and privacy that may or may not be year-round coverage. Usually they're going to be plants that are more deciduous. If you're really close from neighbor to neighbor, you're going to have to look at some of the alternative choices potentially if you're trying to stay more firewise. So here are some of the fire prone plants to avoid for our region. And I mentioned a few of those already. And so some of these are native and some of these are non-native. I throw in some of the potential ones from Western Oregon too, and in case we have some folks from Western Oregon on this webinar. In 1936, gorse contributed to a wildfire that burned down the coastal town of Bandon, which was the first wildland urban interface wildfire in Oregon. And so you really do want to be thoughtful about what's in that first immediate and intermediate zone. The fire prone landscaping here is an example of a mugo pine, which is also a common shrub that's used here in Central Oregon. You can see how it was completely burned, completely consumed. So that one's going to be one of your more fire prone landscape plants. And here's an example of fir tree branches touching a roof line. You want to avoid those types of situations. Here's another case study. This is the Oak Knoll fire from Ashland that occurred in 2010 in a residential neighborhood right near I-5. So if you're looking right down this main highway here, this is I-5. Unfortunately, in this case, a total of 16 acres were burned and 11 homes were lost, as well as one unused barn. The fire burned on both sides of the highway simultaneously, with spotting across the freeway very early on in the fire. So it originated here. It was human caused. And then with the wind direction, so this is where weather and topography play a role in the wind direction. It hopped over and hit this neighborhood back here. And you can see here's a close-up of the neighborhood. Unfortunately, the homes that were lost. So in this case, the primary culprit that promoted the fire and caused there to be a lung fuel source there was the Leyland cypress, was one of the primary plant materials used there around the homes and the landscapes. So again, this cypress is going to have very similar characteristics to arborvitae and ornamental juniper. So characteristics of fire resistant plants, which is what we want to focus on, are going to be plants that have broad leaf. Typically, they tend to be deciduous plants, meaning they shed their leaves in fall. You have some thick leaf evergreens that are also considered to be fire resistant, meaning those leaves aren't going to be consumed very easily, going to be more resistant to lighting. Leaves tend to have more moisture content in them, can be easily crushed in your hand. It's going to be trees that when they do exfoliate or drop their leaves, they're going to be clean. It's going to drop to the ground where you can clean it up if you need to. And shrubs are low growing with minimal dead material. So examples of that would be mock orange and red maple. The sap on more fire resistant type plants are more water-like and typically do not have a strong odor. But what's important to point out with fire resistant type plants is as the moisture changes seasonally, what's available to the plant, how you're continuing to irrigate throughout the summer from the beginning spring. For example, right now we have just seasonal green up occurring with moisture that's already in the ground. But as the season progresses, plant material is going to depend on supplemental irrigation in most cases. Know that that can impact the fire resistant qualities of that plant. So if those plants are drying out or under drought stress, they're going to start to show signs of dieback and they potentially become less fire resistant. So the fire resistant changes as the plant matures as well. And then environmental factors in general can affect those plant characteristics. What we do know is that the condition of the plant within the landscape is important. Fire resistant plants are not they are not completely fire proof. That means they're going to burn. It doesn't mean those plant materials won't burn. Anything can burn, especially if the fire resistant plants are poorly maintained or inadequately watered or surrounded by wood bark mulch. It's not that the plants won't burn. It's that they have the ability to potentially slow the fire down or cool the fire down if they're a well-maintained plants. So for example, this Delosperma, here's another close-up of the Delosperma I mentioned earlier that was in that front landscape. It has a very succulent, moisture-rich content type foliage on it. It can potentially slow the fire down or block the flames. Shorten flame length, which is important. More fire-prone plants tend to extend flame length. And then the amount of heat can be reduced, allowing time for the fire crew to come in and help put a fire out. So maintenance is critical in creating a defensible space around your home and making sure that you're taking care of your plant material. Pruning is something else to be considered as far as landscape maintenance goes and creating a Firewise landscape. Here's an example I show of, these are cultivated blue spruce. I call it a sprucicle, spruce on a stick. And you can see if you're not pruning properly, you can actually make a plant become more fire prone because you're creating dead wood within that plant material prematurely. And so in this case, spruce are one of those plants that actually don't require any pruning, although we as landscapers like to prune anything, but they actually don't require pruning. In this case, obviously they're trying to maintain a certain aesthetic and how these frame the home. Unfortunately, the pruning went too far back into old wood, and this old wood doesn't have any growing points on it. So there's no buds there that are going to sprout and send out new growth. It's just going to be this dead space going forward. You can kind of see here on that, this outside edge will continue to grow and fill in. So eventually it'll probably get masked but going back this far and this deep created dead space. And now this is kind of gonna be extended outward as the plant continues to grow. Same thing happening here on the Mugo pine off to the right and left here. If you're taking a closer look at that, you can see these have been pruned improperly too far back into the old wood. So there's no new growing points. And so you're just going to have dead wood there. So in this case, you'd want to be removing these branches. Of course, there's lots of different things going on here that are not Firewise in this photo, with the wood decking and the conifer being up close to the home. And does this work to think and be thoughtful about the design and placement of where different types of plants go? Absolutely. Here's a good example of a case study. This was the Aubrey Butte Fire in Bend in 2007, where a wildfire broke out on the construction site when sparks from cutting pipe or rebar ignited dry fuels. There are homes right at the top here in the distance, if you look up slope here. So this is what the fire looked like as it exploded in some of the native plant material and shrubs. And then it started, based on the direction of the wind, started moving over to the right, producing larger flames here. So this is what the burn vegetation looked like at the top of the slope where those shrubs were. And in this case, these are Mugo pine and spruce. And you can see they were fully consumed for the most part. You have a little bit of foliage left on these. Thankfully, the fire got put out before they were fully consumed, but they burned hot and contributed to some of the bubbling that you're seeing here. You can see if you look closely along the paint here, the siding, you've got the pergola here that's scorched, and then you also have some of this paint coming up from that radiant heat. Here's a close-up of what that looks like, and you can see the plants that burned. And here's another photo from the home. If you look to the side here, and these are aspen trees. So you've got Mugo pine here in the forefront, you've got aspen trees here. And so if you look at this from a distance, the way that this fire hit, the heat from those Mugo pine shrubs was directed, so they were burning here in the front, and it was directed towards those aspen. Thankfully, aspen, being more fire resistant, was able to absorb and deflect a lot of the convective and radiant heat that was going to be hitting the side of the home there. So in this case, this is a good example where you have that combination of both fire prone and fire resistant type plant material. And you can see the roles that played in this particular fire. This is the home next to the one I just showed you. The fire moved across the slope below this house where the firefighters are walking in this photo. The green hedge in front of this house was Arctic willow, which is a common shrub that can be used here. It's a more fire resistant type plant as your basic deciduous foliage. So you can see below here is where the fire moved across the slope. This border up here close to the home is the Arctic willow border, shrub border. And so the fire raced uphill in this case. It was interesting. The willow did burn. Again, fire resistant plants does not mean fireproof. So the willows did burn, but they were able to take the brunt of the heat and block that heat from going right directly towards the home and giving the fire crew time to put the fire out. It's a really good thing that willow was there, because right behind the willow, closer to the home, was a whole hedge border of Mugo pine. So this is an example, again, where you can kind of see the role that fire resistant plants can play. So in thinking about how to create a more defensible space around your home and be firewise in the landscape, just start to go through a checklist, and it doesn't necessarily have to be done all in one season, but you can start to work your way down through the checklist, because it's time consuming to get it all taken care of. immediately. You can just kind of space it out and start to move through. So removing weeds, mowing grass to a height of 4 inches or less, those types of things can be done immediately. Taking, if you're in an area that has native pine, getting the pine needles out of the gutters, replacing that mulching material to something that's non-combustible, clearing the roofs, decks, gutters of any type of collected debris is all helpful. Just doing a walk around your home and just thinking about your current plant placement, what's already there. If you have existing landscape plant material, and then gradually replacing it. So in this case, having this mugo pine in the corner up against the home and that first 0 to 5 feet, you'd want to be thoughtful about replacing that, taking it out. And you really don't need to put anything back in that first 0 to 5 feet. Here's another example of a home that's this community is becoming more Firewise, but lots of work here to be done in the case of this. You can see they did limb up the lower branches on these are Scotch pine, but then there's a border of arborvitae in the front here too, which it looks like the deer are browsing, doing a good job browsing here. That's why they look kind of funny the way they're growing. You can kind of see some of that accumulated dead material within, because the deer are going all the way back into that old wood. But probably consider removing these and gradually replacing this plant material with either hardscaping or definitely plants that are more fire resistant. And here are just some examples from that neighborhood. They're trying to convert and create a more fire resistant type landscape. So there are some elements going on here. The plants are pretty continuous here, so you'd want to be really thoughtful in looking at what you've got in the landscape and whether it's fire resistant or fire prone. The good news is that we have Extension has now what is a fire program extension team, and we have an individual based here in the Central Oregon region that serves our counties. So you can always plug in and get some additional resources, and they're going to be able to answer a lot of other questions that I don't address in the Firewise landscaping piece. So know that that's an option for you here at the fire program website. I know there's lots of events coming up the next few weekends too, being promoted in our region. Resources available to you would include fire resistant plant publication. This just got updated and was released in the fall electronically. And in fact, this past week, we just got this in hard copy in our office. So we now have hard copy versions available, but it's also available web-based at the link you see here on your screen. So in the fire resistant plant guide is going to be plant material that is considered more fire resistant. I tell folks, if you're looking to try and cross-reference and you want to find some information online, besides this fire resistant plant book, which is a pictorial plant guide, you can, if you're doing a Google search, this is just a good practice in general when you're looking for gardening information, since there's a lot of different types of information out there. You type in whatever the topic is, in this case, fire resistant plants, you type in the word site and put colon and then edu. And by putting that qualifier in there, site colon edu, that's going to pull up all the research based information. It's going to pull all the university sites that are doing research on that particular topic. Fire resistant plant research there's not a lot of it out there. That's what I'm trying to say. So the progress in doing research on fire resistant plants is pretty slow moving. And if you think about that, the type of work that would need to be done, you're basically you're growing plants up just to burn them and see how they're consumed and qualify them. It's an expensive type of research, and there's a lot of variables affect being able to call a plant fire resistant depending on where it's planted, how it's planted, the soil type it's in, the elevation. All those variables play an impact on whether or not a plant is fire resistant from one location to the next or one state to the next. So some research, there's been some research since the original fire resistant plant publication came out that I was able to include in this update. But just to give you an idea of what it looks like on the inside. This is, we have entries, we have photographs, and then I'm gonna talk about the plant a little bit. We have the basic characteristics of the plant, and then we did try to include if it's considered more deer resistant. Again, deer resistant, not deer proof, but it will tell you the requirements, light versus sunlight versus shade, and the water use. So I'm trying to cross-reference all the things that are important to us here in this region, whether or not something's water wise. And then also, we will include if it attracts pollinators, butterflies, birds, and what the circle means. There's native plant choice, either the one shown in the image is native, or there's native species of that genus available for choice. So you can kind of be cross-referencing all the different things that you want to be looking for and creating your Firewise landscape. There are some other searches out there if you're interested. This research was done in southern Idaho, and some of the variables they looked at, this is one of the ones that had a lot of ornamental plant material included in the research that was done. And the types of variables they were looking at in determining giving a plant what they were calling a fire resistance score. So the higher the number, the closer it could be planted to the home. So those that had 7, 8, 9, 10 in the score could be planted closer to the home. And the types of variables they were looking at was the mineral content, moisture content, oil content, and then the height and the width of the plant as to whether or not it should be included. So if you have an interest, you could go to this website and look up some of those plants as well. And just another research study I wanted to show you. This one is more from the Eastern United States. Ohio State University was one of the partners in this study, and they were looking at flammability components such as ignitability, sustainability, combustibility, and consumability. So there is some crossover in some of the plant material here and whether or not what the Firewise rating was on those different plants. We can transfer some of those over, but some of the plant material isn't suitable for our region. And going back in the plant guide that we updated, I also am mentioning any of the species under certain genera that would be considered invasive and ones to avoid, so that we're not introducing invasive plant material here. Just want to mention this, if you're over in the Silverton area and ever have visited the Oregon Garden, they have a fire safety house where a house was built and was specifically landscaped to be more Firewise. So give you a real life example. They're in the process of updating it as the plant material is matured and grown in. I was over there last year walking around with them, and I think they're in the process of doing a revamp there at this fire safety house, but it might be something down the road for you to check out. Just give you a couple views here. They have some large conifer that I've really filled in that need to be moved from here, but it is an interesting example to look at. Here in the Central Oregon region at Bend, we have the Elp and Glow Demonstration Garden that's put on OSU Extension, and our Central Oregon Master Gardener Association have a project here where we have different beds for different purposes, and we do have a Firewise bed in here where you can kind of see that transitional area and just some examples of fire resistant plant material. So at this point now, I'm just going to go through some of the plants that are considered to be fire resistant plants, talk about those that can be adapted for our region. And then after that, I will take questions if there are questions. So when thinking about selecting plant material for your Firewise landscape, these are some of the more important features you should be looking at when determining what you want to put in your landscape. Of course, you need to think about the site and if it's going to be adaptable for that particular plant. So sunlight, wind, less water or moisture, more moisture, those types of things. Adaptability, you want to make sure it's non-invasive. Buy a high quality plant that's healthy, and by high quality, I just mean one that looks healthy to start with, so that you're starting off with a good chance of it going and being established. And then mature size is always an important feature that especially in a Firewise landscape, you really want to be thoughtful, because when you buy a plant at the nursery, you're getting it young. And so you really, really want to be thoughtful in how big is this plant going to get at maturity? Where is this plant going to be in 5 years? It's always a little bit hard. We always tend to want to overplant when we have a new landscape we're putting in just because we want it to look filled in. But what ends up happening is the plants mature 3 to 5 years out. You're having to take plant material out, remove it, or you're having to prune it in a funny way to try and maintain certain size. So be thoughtful in preparation and planning from the beginning. Here's creeping phlox, just an example of Firewise of spring blooming. This one's in bloom right now here in the region. Things like agasaki, just showing you an individual plant here is a late season one. So the other thing you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about plant material is the season of bloom. What do you have going on early? If you want to have a lot of interesting color, textures, and interest in the garden year round, you want to be thinking about the seasonal bloom and what's going to bloom for me early season, mid season, and late season. So I always have something interesting going on in the garden. And here's a close-up of one of the Dilospermas. They come in a lot of different variety, colors, and choices. This one actually is called Fire Spinner. So just some examples of what a Firewise landscape can look like. Here we've got a couple of different plants that are considered Firewise here. This is one of the penstemons starting to leaf out. So I'm going to start with some of the lower growing ground covers and work my way up in size on different types of plant material. So woolly thyme, any of the thymes for that matter, are going to be good choices just because they stay so low to the ground. So even if they were to catch fire, the flame length is not going to be that high that it should be a significant problem. So woolly thyme, there's lots and lots of cultivated varieties of thymes that you could use that in some cases are steppable. This is one that could be considered an alternative to turf grass if you're trying to be more low water use and reduce your water use. You could put something like woolly thyme in because it actually can be steppable as well. So you can step on it lightly and you won't damage the plant. It can take the light footing. So here it is being used around pavers. This is what the flower color looks like when it's in bloom. And pretty drought tolerant. Here just showing you how it can spread through a landscape area. This one was going right up to the home in this case, but which I wouldn't recommend for Firewise, but just want to show you how it can move or spread through a landscape. This one is just another alternative thyme. This might be the dwarf thyme. And again, this is just really showy when it's in bloom. Usually this purple to pink bloom. There are some white blooming thymes as well you could use. So dead nettle would be another low ground cover. This one prefers some shade, so it can take morning light, east side exposure, and then you want to give it some reprieve in the afternoon. So you can be using this underneath some tree canopies. Again, it won't get really tall. Here's a close-up of that blossom, and the leaf is kind of a silvery white leaf. Moderate to low water use in this case. Snow in summer is another one. This is a pretty broad spreading ground cover. It gets a white flower on it, likes full sun. You can see a little taller, gets to be about 6 to 8 inches of mature height. So if you're using ground covers, just be thoughtful in that they do tend to spread and they're going to fill a space in. So you want to be thoughtful in where those fuel breaks may be if you're going to be using them in the landscape. Creeping phlox is the pink blooming flower we see here in this image. And there's a close-up of what that looks like. Creeping phlox, like I said, is in bloom right now around town and comes in a lot of different color varieties as far as the blooms go. You got the pinks, the whites, kind of pale blues, purples. This one too, when it's done blooming, as creeping phlox matures over a couple of seasons, growing seasons, you're going to want to keep it pruned back because it can kind of get dead material within. And so you want to keep that pruned back so you always have rejuvenated new growth coming out on the creeping phlox. There's a close-up of one called Candy Stripe. Moving on to sedums, there's lots of different sedum ground covers. We have both native and non-native sedum that you can get here. Low water use, full sun. You can see this is a hot, dry location and right up against rocks. They do really well. Here's two sedums in this photo side by side. One has more of a maroon reddish type foliage, and then one has this variegated leaf where it's green, kind of with a yellow creamy margin on the outside edge of the leaf. Sedums do bloom and can be showy when in bloom, but predominantly grown for the foliage. Has a high moisture content level in the leaf or the foliage, so it's a really good choice. Here's a close-up of the other one that kind of tinged out maroon. And I'm just showing you here a lot of the varieties of sedums. They have larger leaves, smaller leaves. They can be white blooming, pink blooming, yellow blooming. And so just to show you, you've got a lot of choices when it comes to using sedum in the landscape. Here's one that's in bloom with the pink blooms. Track some pollinators. So very similar to what we see with Delosperma, which is ice plant. And ice plant, this one's called Mesa Verde, has a light pink blossom. There's also yellow, purple, white. I've kind of seen every variation or color cultivated for Delosperma. And again, this is not the ice plant as commonly called in California that's invasive. This is a different genus that's not invasive. Here's a close-up of those blossoms. And here's what the hardy yellow ice plant looks like. Again, likes hot, dry conditions. You don't want this in a place that's going to be sitting with snow cover in the winter. It'll actually rot out. It's a drought tolerant plant. And purple ice plant, fire spinner. And this photo, the one that's in bloom, is pine leaf penstemon. So we've got native pine leaf penstemon. There's cultivated varieties of pine leaf penstemon. Here's what it looks like close up. I like this perennial. Well, you really can't go wrong with penstemons here. There's a lot of native and non-native varieties. They do really well. This one, the pine leaf in particular, if you keep it deadheaded as it's blooming, it'll keep blooming for you. It's one of the longest blooming perennials you can use and comes in a variety of colors. This is kind of the red, dark orange one. And then you have yellow varieties, you have light orange varieties. So you've got a lot of choices there with the pine leaf penstemon. Richardson's penstemon is one of our natives. So I'm just giving you an idea of different variation in leaf color, flower color, different types of blossoms. This one's called Firecracker. There's a dark red blossom on it, and you can kind of see this one was used in an apartment complex here in Central Oregon. So you can see the showy impact it has here against that non-combustible mulch material too. Unfortunately, in this photo, there's lots of cheatgrass too, which would not be encouraged in a Firewise landscape. So you want to take that cheatgrass out, but the penstemon is a good option for a Firewise landscape. And here's just another, just showing you a few additional photos of how, again, you can have that variation in leaf color with penstemon. Here's one of the lower growing ones that are in full bloom. Moving up in height and perennials, you can use yarrow in a landscape. And, you know, as we see a lot of folks start to transition away from using turfgrass in Central Oregon region, yarrow is actually one you can use as an alternative. And so you could put that in as a ground cover and keep it mowed. It'll be something that could be continuous in a stand that as an alternative and requires less water than a turfgrass environment would need. And the native one here is the Western yarrow, which is white blooming. You can see here. And if you look closely in the center of this one, you can see one of our native pollinators on that. So it does attract native pollinators. Drought tolerant, full sun for the yarrows, cultivated or native varieties. Blue flax is another native. Again, this one, quickly consumed if it does catch fire. So it's not one that's going to contribute greatly. Taller perennial, so you'd want to be careful. You don't want to have this up against under a tree like you see in this image, but just something that can be used full sun, low water use because it's native. Sunrose is another perennial, usually mid-range as far as height, about 6 to 12 inches max. It's one of the older established perennials that is still being sold, and it comes in a variety of different colors. So close up here, the pink one, but it comes in white and oranges and that sort of thing. Full sun. Daylily. Lots and lots of cultivated varieties of daylilies can be used. This is the Stella Diora. It's known for its longer bloom time. Again, you want to keep this cleaned out. So if you have one of the daylilies, it gets any of the daylilies, once they're done blooming, that stalk kind of becomes a little bit dried out. You don't want to go in and manually remove that spent stalk and flower head. So what I'm showing you here are in this, and what we have in our fire resistant plant guide. These are going to be plants where there's actually been research done on the fire resistant properties or characteristics. I get asked a lot about other plant material in the region. Can I use this, or does this tends to carry the characteristics you mentioned? Can this be considered fire resistant? And some people like to use the characteristics as their guide. Know that what's in the fire resistant plant guide are going to be plants where there was actually research done. And as I mentioned, there's not a tremendous body of work on the research done on fire resistant plant material. So what you're seeing here are plants where there's actually been research done on whether or not they're fire resistant. Here's a red hot poker. And this one is a taller border perennial that can be used and does come in different cultivated colors and varieties. Full sun. Similar as far as being a taller border perennial as the yucca, and it's a low water use plant, really doesn't need additional moisture once established, and you can see it here in bloom. Caromachy Daphne is one of the few Daphnes we can use in our region. This is not the best photo of it, but just wanted to show you the overall growth habit is more rounded. Gets to be about 4 to 6 feet, has a really fragrant blossom on it. And there's a close-up of the foliage as well. Lilacs are one of the more drought-tolerant ornamental shrubs we can use here. And probably if we're looking at Firewise, you're wanting to look at something that's not going to get quite so big. So this is likely a common purple lilac, but I would suggest using some of these smaller varieties that are considered like the French hybrids. You can see in the against the wall here, 3 in a row. They're going to stay a little bit smaller in size for you and be more manageable as far as keeping them well maintained. Close up of the blossom. Moving on, Lewis mock orange is going to be another. This is one of our native mock orange. This one would have Firewise principles to it, and a really fragrant blossom, and attracts native pollinators as well. Close up of that blossom. Red twig dogwood, or also known as Rhodosiae dogwood, is here in the forefront. There's a close up of the blossom. Fruit set. Likes full sun to part shade, and there's a close up of the twigs, what they look like in winter. And so they add some winter texture to your landscape as well. There's a lot of different cultivated varieties of dogwood. So we have our native red twig dogwoods, but then we also have cultivated varieties like, for example, Kelsey dogwood here on the right. You can see it. It's the height on this is 2.5 feet, maybe 3 feet max. So it stays really small, tight, and rounded. So that's a good option for closer towards the home. You can keep it pretty low. Golden currant is going to be one of our native shrubs, has a really fragrant yellow blossom. This one's in bloom right now in our demonstration garden. That can be used off to the right. You can see some of the fruit set on it. Western spirea is another native, low water use, and you can see the blossom on this is kind of a fuzzy pink flower. This one likes a little bit more moisture though for a native. There's a close-up with that blossom. And fall color on this one. So when you have spent flower heads like this is just to remind me to tell you that, you want to go in and you want to remove those spent blossoms like this that dry out. Moving on to trees, you've got red maples. A lot of the cultivated varieties of red maples are going to be some of the more adaptable tree species for shade trees in our region. There's a close-up of the foliage in fall. And then you have Aspen, one of our native tree species, really one of our few native deciduous tree species. So you can see that used in a parking lot. Here's a close-up of that. Of course, it gets excellent fall yellow color. And there are some cultivars of the quaking aspen as well. We've got Swedish aspen here, which has a more upright, narrow growth habit and a more serrated leaf and kind of an orange fall color instead of full yellow. Be aware though, aspen are genetically geared to create growth. So when you get all those sprouts coming up at the base of aspen, that's normal for them. So you need to be thinking of that. If you're going to include an aspen in your environment and you have just an urban landscape environment, know that those aspen are going to send up sucker sprouts because they're supposed to do that, supposed to create these growths. So you need to be thoughtful in considering where you put them. Crab apples are a really good choice for a Firewise plant in Central Oregon. Here's the spring snow. This is one that doesn't have fruit set. It's a sterile variety. So you get the blossoms. They smell amazing. They're just starting to go in our demo garden here. Close up with the blossom, and then they attract the bees as well. So lots and lots of choices. Here's another one called Royal Raindrops, has more of a teardrop shaped growth habit, pink blossoms, kind of a reddish bark color to it. So lots of choices for a crabapple, and any of those would be useful in a Firewise landscape. Chokecherry, we have both native and non-native chokecherry, white flowers that are fragrant. There's what a close-up looks like. They're going to sucker at the base, so you're going to want to keep the suckers pruned out. Here's Schubert. Schubert's leaves out green, but then turns reddish foliage through the summer during the growing season. Serviceberry, we've got serviceberry trees, cultivated varieties, and then we also have native serviceberry shrubs that can be used in a Firewise landscape. So they blossom, the blossom color is white, and that's what they look like during the summer. So they're kind of a thinly open, loose branching type of tree, a good choice for a Firewise landscape. Here's what the flower looks like close up. And there's the fruit set. Fruit set is edible. You can make jams and jellies, or the birds will eat the fruit happily if you don't want to use it. And then you get nice fall color with the serviceberry, kind of a reddish fall color. So with that, I'll take questions if there are any, and I'll see if I can take, let's see, I'll get back on here with the video. Can figure that part out. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think, and I will start the video. And okay, well, so thank you all for attending. Let me see what questions I have here. Now I'm going to pull those up. Okay. Thank you for doing this. What is the good alternative to Mugo pines that would provide year-round interest with drip system and grown in similar exposure as Mugo? So, you know, if you look in the guide, there's going to be some medium to large size shrubs. Mugos can come in dwarf varieties as well. So I don't know what size ultimately you're looking for, but things like the red twig dogwood would be an alternative. There's not going to be an alternative. Well, you know, Oregon grape is considered a fire resistant plant. So if you're wanting evergreen, then Oregon grape might be one of your best bets as far as having evergreen coverage year round. So that, and they're about similar in size. So that might be a good option for you if you like the looks of Oregon grape. And of course, that's a native one, so it'd be a low water use, even lower water use than Mugo pines. Appreciate aspen as fire resistant, but they can also be invasive. Well, they're technically not considered invasive. It's just the normal way of their growth habit, as I mentioned, but they should be considered because they do create growths genetically. That's what they're supposed to do. So they should be considered in that regard. And that's what your question is pointing towards, I think. So we talked about that a little bit already. Thanks for that question. How about birch? So unfortunately, birch are hot. Well, if you're going to use a birch, you want to use river birch potentially. because most of the white barked birch, which looks similar as far as the trunk color, are really receptive to the bronze birch boring insect, which if you have lived here for a while, you know that in the early 2000s, we had the bronze birch borer come in and take out about 80% of the white barked birch population in the Central Oregon region. So we no longer encourage the use of the white barked birch, although there's a couple resistant cultivars out there. I think one called Heritage, but I point people towards river birch, which has a cinnamon colored bark. It is not going to be. Now, the other thing about the birch is they do have the peeling kind of exfoliating bark. So it can be okay as a choice, but there's not going to be anything that quite looks like the aspen, unfortunately. Surface berry might be an option for you. How do roadies do as far as Firewise plants? The roadies are considered Firewise, so that can be a good option for you. If you're going to plant rhododendrons in Central Oregon, we have an insect pest here called root weevils that love rhododendrons in general, with the exception of rhododendrons that are PJM, like P as in Paul, J as in John, M as in Mary. If you find the PJM varieties, they are resistant to the root weevil and the root weevil damage. And so I would be looking for those ones. They have a purple bloom on them. I'd be looking to plant those ones if you're going to look at a rhododendron. I'm considering a wood deck replacement, but is the plastic rubber-based decking fire resistant? Unfortunately, I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer this question. We're gonna have to find an answer for you from one of the other extension fire folks. I don't know enough about that to answer. It would seem to me maybe not being plastic or anything petroleum based, I would think would not be a good option, but I don't know what the general suggestion is for that now. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that for you, Lee. And then will LAPDH credits be offered for this? I don't know the answer to that either. I don't think any credits were applied for, so it could be, if you want to email me separately and I can share my screen again with my email address. We can find out if that's something. I don't know if you're able to apply for those credits. I mean, I assume this is landscape architect. I don't know what the PDH part stands for, unfortunately, but if you need to have some sort of something sent in regard to getting credit for it, I can help you with that if you'd like, Heidi. Any other questions? Let's see, make sure I didn't miss any in here. Oh, okay. Confusing to say aromatic foliage is a flammable characteristic and then list Agastache and thyme as plants to use. Yeah, that's a good point. So there are some aromatic plants that have proven in research to be fire resistant because they don't sustain the flame. And a good example of that is lavender, actually. So you would think lavender would be considered a fire prone plant. And in fact, lavender is considered fire resistant because in the research, it actually didn't burn hot, and it was the way the fire was consumed, how a fire consumed the plant, excuse me. So you're right. It's this exact type of question is what makes pointing directly to plants saying they're fire resistant difficult and challenging, and the research challenging, because those are general guidelines. But Agastache actually has a high moisture content to it. And thyme, predominantly, it's because of the low growing height of it that it would be considered more fire resistant. Let's see, any others? Professional development hours, thank you. Now I know what that means. Yeah, so let me put, how long will this presentation be available online? That I don't know.
I think it's 30 days, although it may be longer.
And we're going to be doing this class in some other places too, if people missed today. So I'm going to share my screen again back to my email. So if Heidi wants to email me, we can try and facilitate getting credits if you need our help in doing that. I think that hopefully that's showing my email address. Is it showing my email address?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay. So, and then Diane, we should be able to get an answer for you how long, if somebody wants to check into that for Diane, how long? You can email me as well, and then we'll get an answer for you.
It is 30 days.
Oh, it's 30 days? Okay. All right, any other questions? All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much for participating today in our spring gardening seminar class. Your feedback helps us improve our webinars, so please remember to complete the survey after the presentation ends. And please support our sponsors listed on the screen. Thank you, Amy Jo. It's been very informative. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, do you guys need anything else from me?
Looks good. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to end the webinar.
Okay, thanks
Thank
Nancy.
you.
Thanks Rocky.